Hi everyone, and welcome to the second in this seminar series. My name is Rebecca Sear, and I'll be talking about family fertility and child success. So this is the second seminar in our seminar series for our project, which is funded by the John Templeton Foundation on the evolutionary dynamics of religion, family size and child success. You can find us online, on Twitter and on OSF. This project is a team effort with multiple team members across 4 different universities. We are also working with partners in Malawi, the Gambia, Bangladesh and India, because we're going to be doing some primary data collection in those countries. So the PI John Shaver introduced this grant last month and talked about some of our preliminary research. So the impetus for this project is really the paradox of religious fertility. So we know that religious mothers tend to have more children than less religious mothers or secular mothers in industrialized societies, at least. We also know that there's a negative relationship between number of siblings and child outcomes because parental resources are spread more thinly in larger families, so child outcomes tend to be somewhat less favorable in larger families, all else equal. However, despite their higher fertility, there is little evidence that religious mothers have children who suffer this penalty of large family size. This is the paradox of religious fertility. How is it that religious mothers are buffering their children against these somewhat negative outcomes due to large family size that we see in other types of family? The solution may be religious allo parenting. So religious women are able to use their co-religionists in order to help them raise their children and therefore buffer their children against any potential negative consequences of growing up in large families. So this project overall hasn't, the primary data collection at least hasn't got underway for this project yet, so we can't talk too much about the results from this project. What I'm going to focus on in this talk is the allo parenting aspect of the project, because that's the area of research that I've been working on for the last 20 years. All right, so let's go back to first principles. What is allo parenting? Allo parenting is simply parenting from anyone other than the child's parents. Across species, this is quite an unusual form of raising offspring. Particularly in mammals, maybe only about 3% of mammals engage in allo parenting, where anyone other than the offspring's parents are involved in raising the offspring. One example are meerkats, though. That is one allo parenting species. In most mammal species, there is parental care, but it largely comes from the mother or occasionally both parents. Allo parenting is a little bit more common in bird species. Maybe 9 or 10% of bird species engage in allo parenting, but still on the whole, it is quite a rare thing to do. The picture on the right are long-tailed tits, incidentally, which I believe are the only birds which engage in allo parenting here in the UK. So it's widely believed that although allo parenting is quite a rare strategy across species, humans are one of those species that do engage in this allo parenting or cooperative reproduction. So Sarah Hurley's on the screen here. She is the anthropologist who has done most to develop this idea that humans engage in cooperative reproduction or are cooperative breeders. So in our own species, the proverb, "It takes a village to raise a child," really is true. It really does seem to be the case that parents are receiving a lot of help from other individuals to raise children. And if you're not aware of this body of research, I would very highly recommend Sarah Hurley's book, Mothers and Others, where she talks about the evidence for allo parenting and cooperative reproduction in our species. She even suggests that our need for cooperative reproduction actually underpins our success as a species. Cooperative reproduction leads to cooperation in many other areas of our lives, and it's our ability to cooperate with one another that is likely to underlie our great success as a species. So some of the earliest evidence about allo parenting in our species was developed by Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues who worked with Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues found evidence that Hadza grandmothers were very hardworking. They were still producing a lot of food, which was used to feed their grandchildren. So retirement doesn't seem to exist so much in Hadza hunter-gatherers. Here is more evidence for allo parenting or cooperative reproduction in our species by the demographer Ron Lee. What you see here are labour income and consumption curves across the life course for different types of population. If you look at the black lines to begin with, I hope you can see my cursor, these black lines refer to data from hunter-gatherer populations. This one here is hunter-gatherer consumption, so how many calories hunter-gatherers are eating. The top line here is labour income for hunter-gatherers. This is essentially the number of calories that they're producing. What you can see from this graph is that in hunter-gatherer populations, on average, pretty much until the end of life, hunter-gatherers are, throughout adulthood at least, producing more calories than they consume. So even these older populations who will no longer have young children of their own, at least the women won't, they are still working hard to produce a lot of food, which is then shared amongst their group and is particularly used to feed their grandchildren and their adult children. So this is more evidence for alloparenting, for cooperative reproduction in our species. The patterns incidentally look a bit different with the green and the blue lines. These lines are the labour income and consumption curves for lower and middle income countries and high income countries. Perhaps we can come back to that later. For the moment, the point of this graph is if you look at the black lines, hunter-gatherer populations, even into old age, are producing more calories than they consume. So intergenerational transfers are clearly happening in our species, and Ron Lee has done a lot of work showing the importance of these transfers in the evolution of our patterns of life, what happens across our life course. So intergenerational transfers and grandparents are important in terms of alloparenting and directly provisioning grandchildren, but it isn't just grandparents, it isn't just the older generation who engage in cooperative reproduction and provide parents with help. We know from societies worldwide that older children are very important alloparents too. They often do subsistence work in subsistence societies. Learning how to be an adult in subsistence societies involves essentially working throughout childhood in order to develop the subsistence skills that you need to be an adult in those societies. You have boys here herding, for example. Older children are also very important in terms of direct childcare. They often look after their younger siblings, other relatives, and sometimes unrelated individuals as well. So children are also very important alloparents in our species. In some populations, unrelated individuals are alloparents too. There are some hunter-gatherer societies which rely quite heavily on meat, which is hunted by men, such as the Ache on the screen here. In these populations, fathers cannot provision their children alone, so they need help from other men to help provision their children. And often in these societies, you have a belief system set up which says that children can have more than one father. And these multiple fathers then produce food in order to feed these children. So alloparents in some societies can be other adults in the population, not grandparents or older siblings or older children. In contemporary industrialised populations, we also rely quite a lot on unrelated individuals to help raise our children in terms of either paid or state-provided childcare for young children, and also formal schooling. Formal schooling education is often not considered part of our alloparenting network, but in fact it provides a very useful service for parents. They can leave their children in a safe place while they go to work, and in this environment too, children are being taught the skills that they need in industrialised societies to be successful adults. And just to illustrate that alloparenting is a feature of all human societies, not just traditional subsistence societies, the effect of the pandemic has clearly shown the importance of alloparenting in our species. Here's a tweet and a news article about the effect that the COVID pandemic has had on families who have lost their alloparents, essentially. During lockdowns, parents lose childcare, they lose formal schooling, and they often lose access to grandparents as well, who still do a lot of childcare in high-income populations. So in all types of societies, there is a lot of evidence that alloparenting is important to help parents parent to raise their children. Just to highlight, we have a new paper coming out as part of this Templeton Foundation funded project very, very shortly, led by Laura Spake, and one of the research fellows on the project, which talks about allo-mothering networks in high-income countries in the UK and the US. That will be coming out very shortly indeed. Okay, so what do we know so far about alloparenting in our species? Well, first of all, we know it happens. We know that parents are getting a lot of help from various different individuals in order to raise their children. This is mostly qualitative data. This is mostly data that from parents, which talks about the importance of allo parents in their lives. For example, Judy O'Bell has done a couple of systematic reviews of the literature looking for evidence of the importance of grandmothers in particularly child nutrition and the nutrition of mothers and pregnant women as well. Judy O'Bell has found that grandmothers are very important in terms of providing a lot of support and advice during this period to young mothers and to their children. There is also some quantitative data on exactly how much help allo parents are providing, although perhaps the amount of quantitative data that exists is a little bit less than you might expect, given that I've just said that in evolutionary anthropology, at least, it's a very widespread belief now that humans are cooperative breeders, that we engage in cooperative reproduction. It's also worth pointing out at this point that alloparenting in the human literature is typically interpreted quite broadly. There are many different things that alloparents do that can help parents raise children. This includes directly provisioning children or the parents of children with food or other resources, or doing direct hands-on childcare, so washing, feeding, holding, carrying children. But it can also be other forms of help, such as help to parents with domestic and productive work, which then frees up parents' time to focus on childcare. It can also be teaching, training children how to be successful adults. And as Judy O'Bell's reviews show, it can also be the provision of knowledge around raising children, around pregnancy and childbirth, also advice and emotional support. So there are quite a lot of different types of support out there in the literature that alloparents are providing to parents. The other thing that we know about alloparenting in our species is that it varies between societies, not in whether it exists or not. There is lots of evidence from pretty much every society that's ever been looked at that alloparenting exists in all societies. There aren't really societies where parents are raising children entirely alone. But exactly who is providing parents with help does vary between populations and what they're doing as well. I've just briefly mentioned that in industrialized societies, for example, we tend to rely more on non-kin, such as paid childcare or state-provided childcare as professional childcarers or professional teachers in school, for example. In subsistence societies, it tends to be more kin-based alloparenting. The third thing we think we know is that alloparenting is associated with positive child outcomes and higher fertility. So the idea here is that if alloparents are providing parents with help to raise children, then the presence of those alloparents should be associated with positive, better child outcomes and also higher fertility. So another idea in the evolutionary anthropology literature is that alloparenting allows women to shorten their birth intervals. If women are getting help to raise their children, then that relieves some of the burden of women taking care of the children themselves, and this means they can progress to subsequent births more rapidly. So there are ideas out there in the literature that alloparenting should be associated broadly with positive child outcomes and with higher fertility. I'm going to question some of that literature in a moment. But first, I want to talk more about the issue of why alloparenting varies between societies and over time in our species. This is not something we yet have a very good handle on. We know that there are some common features in alloparenting. For example, it is very often from kin. And even though in industrialized societies we do rely quite a lot on non-kin, grandparental childcare is still very key, even in industrialized societies. So alloparenting is very often from kin. It's also quite often from maternal kin. This is the mother's family rather than the father's family. And the ideas behind why it comes from kin, particularly maternal kin, focus on kin selection, the idea that kin can gain fitness benefits in terms of gaining greater genetic representation in future generations by helping to raise their grandchildren or other relatives, because grandchildren and grandparents share genes, as do other relatives. So the reason why alloparenting is more often from kin is typically attributed to kin selection. In terms of why it's more often maternal than paternal kin, again, it's attributed to maternal kin gaining more fitness benefits, essentially, from investing in their maternal kin than their paternal kin for a number of different reasons. In terms of variability between societies, one of the reasons why there is variability in who alloparents between societies and what those alloparents are doing is simply the availability of different alloparents. So our species is quite complex in our behaviour. We have many different residence, inheritance and marriage patterns, for example, which affect the availability of different types of kin. In patrilineal societies, or rather patrilocal societies, for example, where individuals move to live with their husband's family after marriage, paternal kin may be more available as allo parents. So there may be some cases where paternal kin are doing more allo parenting than maternal kin. Although even in patrilocal societies, it's often the case that maternal kin are allo parenting as well. So we know that there are differences in residence, inheritance and marriage patterns. I'm not going to say too much more about that. I want to focus on the next two categories in particular of things which might affect the availability of different allo parents: demography and changes in subsistence patterns. Cultural norms too are likely to affect the availability of allo parents, partly because they will affect residence, inheritance and marriage patterns, but also because of things like conceptualizations of motherhood, fatherhood and also childhood. So I've said that in subsistence societies, older children are very often important allo parents. In contemporary industrialized societies, children are typically not very important allo parents. In fact, parents who leave their children alone with older children are likely to find themselves arrested. It's very much frowned on, in fact, to have older children caring for younger children, which is quite a novel phenomenon in our species, but it's quite a strong cultural norm in industrialized societies, and really affects patterns of allo parenting in such societies. As an aside, it may also affect children's ability to develop parenting skills. If they don't get the chance to practice these skills in childhood, it may be that we are lacking one opportunity of teaching our children skills which are useful in adulthood. So the final thing I want to say on this slide is to talk about the interaction between religion and the availability of allo parents, given that religion is key to this Templeton funded project. So the idea, or one idea about how religion might affect allo parenting, is that religious parents can gain allo parenting from co-religionists, as I mentioned towards the start of the talk. And it may even be that as in societies where individuals have less access to their kin, co-religionists may be substituting for kin allo parents in those types of societies. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. First, I want to talk about the issue of demography and how demography might affect the availability of allo parents, because I'm getting involved in a new project right now led by Abby Page, who's on the screen on the left there. She works at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine too, and she has worked on AGTA hunter-gatherers in the Philippines and done some work on allo parenting. And what she has observed in the AGTA is that there aren't very many grandmothers who are available to do childcare. Those grandmothers that are there do childcare, but most children don't have grandmothers. So she is interested in exploring how demographic patterns might affect the availability of different kin, such as grandmothers and grandparents, and how this then might affect the patterns of allo parenting in different societies. So one reason why there may be relatively few grandparents in this particular group is that higher mortality rates mean that fewer individuals survive into grandparenthood. It's also the case that fertility rates may affect the availability of grandmothers as allo parents, because higher fertility rates and longer reproductive lifespans, meaning that women have relatively late last births, will affect the amount of time that grandmothers spend without young children of their own to care for. So one of the reasons why grandmothers are often used as allo parents is that menopause means that older women are not continuing to have children of their own. That means their time is essentially freed up so that they can care for their grandchildren. But the availability of grandmothers will be affected by demographic patterns, both mortality and fertility. And Abby and I are planning to work with Susie Lee, who's also on the screen there, and use her expertise in demographic analysis and demographic modelling to develop a better understanding of how differences in demographic patterns might affect the availability of allo parents, in order to help us understand partly why allo parenting may differ between societies. Something else I want to talk about, which is directly relevant to the Templeton funded project, is how much subsistence strategy matters for allo parenting. So by subsistence strategy, I mean how societies make a living, whether that's hunter-gathering, horticulture, agriculture, pastoralism, or different degrees of market integration and industrialization. Subsistence strategy will affect many different factors which have implications for allo parenting. but it may be a useful sort of overarching topic that we can use to understand why alloparenting differs between societies. So one thing that may be different between different subsistence strategies are demographic patterns themselves. I should say that all of the things on the screen a couple of slides ago about the reasons why the availability of allo parents may differ are all interrelated. It's hard to look at any of them in isolation. And subsistence strategy is going to affect demographic patterns, which may then have a knock-on effect on the availability of allo parents. For example, it's widely thought that horticultural and agricultural populations may have higher fertility and higher mortality than hunter-gatherer populations. Incidentally, this is also a project that Abby Page is working on at the moment to reanalyze some, or to analyze some new data rather, on differences in fertility between different subsistence strategies. It's also the case that market integration and industrialization is associated with changes in fertility and mortality, and that fertility and mortality both decline with market integration and industrialization. But subsistence strategy is not just related to differences in demographic patterns. There are many other factors which may have implications for allo parenting which differ between subsistence strategies. For example, differences in mobility and in residence patterns, which will affect the availability of allo parents. So for example, hunter-gatherer populations tend to be relatively mobile, although kin groups generally move together, extended families generally move together. Relatively mobile compared to agricultural populations, that is. Horticultural and agricultural populations may be relatively settled, relatively less mobile, though again, kin groups and extended families may live together and may work together. Market integration is also believed to be associated with mobility and residence patterns, and that it's associated with greater individual mobility. Very broadly speaking, in subsistence strategies, families are working together to feed each other, to feed themselves. In industrialized market integrated societies, individuals are earning wages, which are then used to support themselves and their family. This means that people may become more mobile in order to seek work in market integrated societies, but they may move individually or as a nuclear family rather than as an extended family. So market integration, industrialization also seems to be associated with shifts away from the extended family and towards more emphasis on the nuclear family, which again affects the availability of allo parents. And in this Templeton Foundation funded project, what we aim to do is to test some of these hypotheses about subsistence strategy and the things associated with it, and how they affect the availability of allo parents, and also how they affect cooperation and childcare between different individuals, religion, fertility and child outcomes. We'll be working in collecting primary data in 5 different sites worldwide. And these sites differ particularly in market integration. They vary in levels of market integration. So we can test some hypotheses about how market integration might affect the availability of allo parents, who is caring for children and how that has a knock-on effect on fertility and child outcomes, and also how it interacts with religion. These populations also represent different religions, different levels of fertility and different types of child outcome as well. So what we intend to do with our primary data collection exercise is to collect the same data across all of these different populations, roughly speaking, of course, and it will be quite detailed data, not just on cooperative childcare, but cooperation more broadly between individuals and how people give and receive help within their social networks. Also, we'll be collecting data on religion and religiosity, on fertility and child outcomes, such as child health, and also things like education. And this will hopefully give us some good insights into how allo parenting and the other aspects that we're interested in vary cross-culturally, because we're putting a lot of effort into developing data collection tools which are very similar across all of these different sites, particularly the 4 postdocs who are working on this project, who have really been putting in a lot of time and effort to make these data collection tools comparable across these quite diverse sites. So Susie Shefnit, Laura Spake, Rob Lynch and Anusha Hassan have really been working on developing comparable data collection tools across these different sites. So one of the directions that research on cooperative childcare needs to go is to develop more data and more theory for that matter on why allo-parenting varies between different societies. That's one of the things that we hope to do with this particular project on the evolutionary dynamics of religion, fertility and child success. The other thing that I said we know about allo-parenting is that it's associated with positive child outcomes and higher fertility. But this is something that I want to question a little bit here. So we do know there's quite a lot of evidence that there are often positive associations between the presence of potential allo-parents and child outcomes or fertility. For example, I've done some reviews of the literature. Here's an example looking at, this is a systematic review of all of the studies which have published data on associations between the presence of potential allo-parents, all of the kin listed on the bottom of the screen there, and child survival. What the graph shows, this is work done with a couple of colleagues, published some time ago now, but what the graph shows is that the green bars indicate the proportion of published studies where a positive association was found between the presence of that parent or allo-parent and child survival. So you can see that maternal and paternal grandmothers are often, but not always, positively associated with child survival. So if the grandmother is around, the child is more likely to survive. Also worth noting that this is always the case with mothers, unsurprisingly, given the importance of maternal care in our species. Fathers and grandfathers show fewer associations between their presence and child survival, but with grandmothers and older siblings too, there are often positive associations between these kin and child survival. More recently, a more detailed systematic review has looked at all of the literature on associations between not just grandparental presence, but also grandparental investment and a much broader range of grandchild outcomes, not just survival, but also other aspects of health, and not just physical health, but socio-emotional health and also cognitive development. And this paper was published Social Science and Medicine a couple of years ago, and I've put their conceptual framework on the screen here, which shows the types of data that they were looking for in their study. And what they found, well, first of all, it might be worth noting that there is quite a lot of evidence, more than 200 pieces of evidence, which looked for associations between some measure of grandparental presence or investment and child outcomes. And what they found were that there were quite often positive associations between grandparental investment and child outcomes. They didn't actually produce any kind of quantitative summary, so it was a bit hard to get a sense of the overall proportion of studies which found positive associations, but there were very many positive associations, but also some null associations between grandparents and child outcomes, and some associations which were actually negative, which suggested that the presence or investment from grandparents was associated with, for example, poorer child health. Though it might be worth noting there that one thing that did consistently come up was that in industrialized societies, grandparents sometimes seem to be associated with higher child weight, higher child BMI, which in public health terms isn't necessarily a good thing, because in industrialized nations, overweight is a problem, but it may still reflect grandparents investing in their children and feeding them, perhaps overfeeding them to the point that they became a bit overweight. So even associations between grandparental investment and negative child outcomes are not necessarily indicative of grandparents harming children in any way, at least intentionally harming. It may be to do with grandparents doing their best to invest in their children, but not doing so in accordance with what a public health professional might advise them to do. In terms of associations between potential allo-parents and fertility, again, there is some evidence that there are associations between the presence of potential allo-parents and higher fertility. This is a systematic review that Christina Moyer did when we worked together a few years ago. Again, looking through the published literature for all of the studies which have published associations between different kin, different categories of kin, different potential allo-parents on the graph here, and different fertility outcomes. Analysing fertility is a little bit harder than looking at child outcomes, because there are many different measures of fertility and they don't all necessarily tell you the same story. But very briefly, what this review of fertility found was that Particularly when looking at the length of birth intervals, the presence of both a woman's parents and her parents-in-law did seem to be associated with shorter birth intervals on the whole, which all else equal would mean higher fertility. This wasn't, as with the child outcome research, this wasn't universal. It's not the case in all populations, but there are quite often associations between the presence of parents and parents-in-law and shorter birth intervals, which all else equal suggest higher fertility. To complicate the story, parents in particular are associated with later first births than the absence of parents, which all else equal actually suggests a reduction in fertility. And I think there is a reason for that, but I'm not going to get into that for the moment. I can talk more about that in the question and answer session if anyone is interested. Okay, so there are a lot of associations between often the presence of potential allo parents and child health and survival or higher fertility. And these are often interpreted as evidence that allo parenting does improve child outcomes and increase fertility. But I think we need to be very cautious with that interpretation, because most of these studies just show associations. They don't show causal relationships between allo parenting and better child health and survival or higher fertility. They're just statistical associations. We do know that allo parents are providing parents with a lot of help in many different respects, but that doesn't necessarily follow that this help is improving child survival or increasing fertility, or at least associations don't prove that convincingly, because there are other explanations that could explain those associations. For example, if you're just looking at the association between the presence of grandparents and higher child survival, for example, you might find a positive correlation there because of healthy family effects. And I mean by that some families are healthier than others for a range of reasons, maybe biological, maybe because they're wealthier families. So you may get associations between long-lived grandparents and higher child survival just because they live in particularly healthy families, whereas families where grandparents have not survived very long may also suffer higher child mortality because those are less healthy families. There is actually rather little research which has looked at, which has really tried to get at whether there is a causal association between allo parenting and child outcomes. About the only exception I'm aware of is this paper at the bottom of the screen by Antti Tanskanen and Mirka Danielsbacker. And they actually found no evidence that allo parenting in the UK was causally associated with improved child outcomes. So one study suggests that perhaps the associations between the presence of potential allo parents and child outcomes may be somewhat over-interpreted. And I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. I'm going to skip straight on to the only study I'm aware of which has tried to get at causality in terms of the association between potential allo parents and fertility. So this is work done by Kristen Snopkowski when we worked together a few years ago. Kristen used the Indonesian Family Life Survey to run a causal mediation analysis of the association between the presence of kin and women's fertility. And in this particular population, the presence of kin, that is the woman's parents and parents-in-law, roughly speaking, was associated with higher fertility. And the path analysis suggests that this association was mediated through the provision of direct physical help. And this was a rare data set which does have a lot of data, not just on the geographic proximity and the survival status of parents and parents-in-law, but also how often they are in contact with their adult children and grandchildren, and how often they are providing help to their adult children and grandchildren. And this was a very lengthy and impressive piece of analysis by Kristen, but to cut a long story short, this analysis is suggesting that the association between the presence of potential allo parents and higher fertility in this case is plausibly mediated through allo parenting, through the provision of help. So again, this is a statistical association, but it's a longitudinal data set which has quite rich data, and I think it does provide some reasonably convincing evidence that in this situation at least there is a plausible causal association between allo parenting and higher fertility. However, there are rather few studies which have actually looked at whether the associations between potential allo parents and either child outcomes or higher fertility are really causal. So one other potential solution to this problem of whether the presence of allo parents really is having much impact on child outcomes or fertility is to collect more detailed data on exactly what allo parents are doing. So a lot of the literature that's out there does just look at fairly crude indicators of potential allo parenting, such as the survival status of allo parents, or whether they are, for example, co-resident with adult children and children. Something Nisha Hassan has done for her PhD work is to collect more detailed data on exactly what allo parents are doing in Tanzania, also working with David Lawson and Susie Schaffnet. And you'll be hearing from Anusha later on in the seminar series, so I'm not going to steal her thunder and tell you what her results are. This is just to mention that we are working on projects which try and get more detailed data on exactly what allo parents are doing. I'm going to instead show you some results from another paper that's just been published in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. So this was a study done in Mexico where the authors collected quite detailed data on grandmaternal support. So not just the presence or absence of grandmothers, but whether they were actually providing support to mothers and their children or not. And again, to cut a long story short, what this study showed was actually rather few associations between grandmaternal support and either maternal or child outcomes. There may be some problems with studies which try and associate the presence or support from allo parents with child outcomes and with fertility. So very roughly speaking, what these studies assume is that all kids have roughly the same level of resources. So here's a child without an allo parent here, a very crude representation on this graph. So all kids have roughly the same amount of resources, but then allo parenting boosts those resources. So children who have allo parenting from a particular allo parent are boosted above all the level of all the other children. That's kind of the assumption behind these tests of whether potential allo parents are associated with improved child outcomes. The idea is that that potential allo parent that you're studying will boost the outcome of that child compared to other children who don't have allo parenting from that specific allo parent, such as a grandmother. But the problem with this idea is that allo parenting is quite complex and it's quite flexible in our species. So for one thing, allo parenting may actually substitute for parental investment rather than add to it. So rather than adding resources to a child, allo parenting may free up parental time to do more childcare, for example, or to do more domestic or to do more subsistence work, for example. Simply looking at the presence of allo parenting doesn't really tell you whether that allo parenting is providing additional support to those children or if it's substituting for parental investment in some way. Another important factor is that allo parenting is flexible, and that if one allo parent isn't available, then parents may find another allo parent instead. This was the interpretation of the authors of the Mexican study, incidentally. They thought that women who lacked grandmaternal support were finding support from other female relatives, so they were substituting in support from elsewhere. So it may not be a simplistic case that children who lack grandmaternal support are doing worse than children who have grandmaternal support, because these children without grandmaternal support may be getting support from other allo parents instead. One final reason why some of these studies may struggle to find positive associations between allo parenting and positive child outcomes is that allo parenting has costs as well as benefits, particular competition within the family for a range of different resources. Again, that's not something I'm going to say too much about here, but I think it is an important point. Cooperative reproduction sets up competition within the family as well as cooperation, because families are living on the same resource base, both in terms of provisioning and food, but also in terms of cooperation for childcare itself. So where do I think research on associations between allo parenting and child outcomes or fertility should go next? Well, one thing I think should happen is certainly more analyses which attempt to get at causality, which do attempt these more sophisticated statistical models to see whether associations between the presence of certain allo parents and particular outcomes are driven by causal relationships. And one thing we hope to do with this Templeton project is to use the Malawi longitudinal study of families and health to try and look at whether there is a causal relationship between the presence of allo parents and the provision of help from allo parents and child outcomes. It's a longitudinal study, so it's the best type of study to do these causal analyses. And Anusha, again, is hoping to do some more sophisticated statistical modelling of this particular study to try and get at causality more closely. Something else that we can do to try and get at this relationship, the relationships between alloparenting and child outcomes or fertility in more detail, is to collect more detailed data on what alloparents are doing and whether it substitutes for or is in addition to parental investment. We can also collect more detailed data on alloparental networks, not just individual alloparents. So a lot of the existing literature looks at, for example, the association between grandmothers and child outcomes. What we hope to do in the Templeton project is to collect detailed data on alloparental networks, so not just focus on an individual carer such as a grandmother. And we also hope to collect data on the provision of help as well as the receipt of help. Again, alloparenting has costs as well as benefits. Somebody is providing alloparenting as well as receiving alloparenting. So these last three things, collecting more detailed data on what alloparents are doing, on alloparental networks, and the provision as well as the receipt of help. These are things we will all be doing in our primary data collection in the Templeton funded project in our 5 different sites. Okay, so let me just end on one final point, which is the implications. What are the implications of our cooperative reproduction? Well, one very important implication is that what is often perceived of as the traditional family in the West is very much not, in fact, the traditional family. So in the West, we think of the traditional family as a male breadwinner nuclear family. What evolutionary anthropological research suggests on cooperative breeding is that we did not evolve in nuclear families. We evolved to live in extended families in cooperative groups where multiple different individuals helped parents to raise children. So one last area of research, which I think needs some more explanation, is research on the consequences of the lack of alloparenting or lack of recognition of the need for alloparenting in industrialized market integrated societies. Because in these market integrated Western societies, if we have the perception that the traditional family is the nuclear family, where parents alone are responsible for raising children, we may be preventing individuals from seeking the support that they need in order to raise their children from beyond the nuclear family. And I just published a paper making this point in the same issue of Philosophical Transactions that the Mexican study was published in. And that is the point that I will end on. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm quite happy to take questions now. I think John will allow you to do that.
Of course, I think I have allowed everyone the ability to unmute themselves and start their video if they would like.
I have a question. Hi, thanks for the great talk. It's about the Templeton project. Like, I'm kind of interested in understanding what the difference is between strong social networks and strong religious social networks. Like, is there something specific about religion that would be make the network stronger than just, I mean, I can't actually think of a good alternative for a church group, say, as a strong religious, as a strong social network. But anyway, just your thoughts on that, please.
I might ask John to step in a moment. I will briefly give my own answer there, but John is certainly the religion expert here. We know that religious people are quite cooperative and that they do tend to help one another. So the idea behind the project is that these religious networks may be substituting for kin-based alloparenting networks, which in societies where you have access to a lot of kin are very important in raising children. Where you don't have access to those kin, religion may essentially fill in the gap by providing these very strong social support networks. Whether other strong social support networks exist that are not religious, it seems likely to me that that may be the case because women do need help to raise children. So it may be that secular women in industrialized societies are trying to build other types of support networks that enable them to raise children. Although it may also be that that is harder to do in the absence of an identifier like religion. But I think it's an open question, one hopefully which we can provide some data on in this project. John, did you want to add anything there as the religion expert?
Only that I'm not an expert. And also, like, forgive me, it's not yet 7 a.m. in New Zealand, but I'll try to do my best to be coherent. The most evidence suggests that relatively similarly sized secular groups aren't as cooperative with one another. They don't have as high levels of trust with one another as secular groups, even when they share some of the same mechanisms that are thought to contribute to high levels of trust and cooperation, such as costs to membership and costly behaviors that may signal the trustworthiness of individuals. It's not clear why that might be. Rich Sosis, who's also part of this grant, suggests it has something to do with the underlying ideologies of those groups, particularly the unfalsifiable nature of supernatural commitments. They encourage higher levels of trust within the group, and secular ideologies don't tend to recruit as much commitment to group members, which allow signaling mechanisms to figure out who's committed to your group and therefore encourage cooperation. But that's more or less just an interpretation of the finding that religious people tend to be more cooperative and trusting with one another, rather than any sort of systematic causal data that suggests that that's the case.
Thank you.
Hi, David.
Hi, I'm watching your cat in the background. I had a question that kind of is in the same vein. So linking together sort of one part of your talk to the wider question. So you talked about the male breadwinner model of the family and how that's not really the traditional family and everything. But one thing that religious groups do in many places is often have quite prescriptive gender norms. And so I did actually wonder if thinking about some of the potential negative impacts of religion on gender norms could explain some of the positive impacts on children. So I know, for example, I have a sister-in-law who joined the Mormon Church explicitly to get help with childcare. So I think the whole project is like spot on. But I also know that she's then being exposed to like quite sort of strict views about how she should respect her husband and shouldn't necessarily maybe promote her own career progression over her husband and so on. And so those kind of dynamics may also change patterns of childcare coming just from the mother rather than her allo parents. And I can think of similar dynamics in places like Tanzania, maybe it's the same in Malawi, where the church can have quite prescriptive gender norms and that could influence things. So I just wondered what you thought about the linkage of those two ideas.
Yeah, I guess it's possible that one of the reasons why religious alloparenting replaces kin-based alloparenting is that religions may have a role in breaking those kin-based networks by emphasizing the nuclear family, the importance of the nuclear family. So I guess there could be some quite complex interactions there. And yes, absolutely, religion and prescriptive gender norms are certainly quite common. I guess I haven't thought too much about how they might interact, though, again, John, can I throw that question to you?
Sure. I mean, certainly that seems to be the case, at least in Western, whatever religions there are in the West, so even Islam in the West, at least. But there are also norms, I believe, for paternal investment as well, and also sort of better cooperation in the marital unit, and also things like an aversion to divorce or to investing resources outside of the marital unit. So there's probably a whole package of norms that would be influencing the fertility.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just something I was thinking of in terms of balancing out the impacts of religion as maybe not necessarily straightforwardly beneficial, but maybe sort of complex. Because often when someone benefits, someone else is picking up the cost, right? And so, yeah. Anyway, really interesting talk. Nice to see you.
Thanks. Hi, Kristen.
Hello. Thank you so much. As always, a great talk. I guess I was interested a little bit in thinking about how you're planning on measuring child quality in particularly in industrial contexts. As you mentioned, it's maybe tricky looking at something like BMI or weight, because all of a sudden we get these negative outcomes if we're thinking about it from a public health perspective, and maybe we see less when you look at things like child mortality. So I was just wondering what you guys are thinking about in terms of measurements of child quality.
Yeah, child quality gets much more complicated when you're doing a cross-cultural study. In fact, I gave a talk in Toulouse last week about this, and Monique Perkoff-Mulder made a very insightful question or comment too in the chat about how it is very difficult to compare across very different societies in terms of things like childcare, not just care, but also child outcomes, because of the way different societies conceive of things like childcare and child outcomes. But to more precisely answer your question, we are collecting data on child health. And although something like BMI can be quite tricky in industrialized context, David himself found that there were some deficits in child height in terms of sibling competition. In larger families, children tend to be a little bit shorter, if I'm remembering your results correctly, David. So there might still be some aspects of child height where you can pick up perhaps effects of allo parenting or stretched parental resources, even in industrialized contexts. But we are also going to collect data on child education. I also think we are collecting data on adult child outcomes as well, in terms of, I'm now forgetting exactly what we're going to collect. Anusha or Laura might be able to help me out here, or Susie or Robert. Yeah, I might, can you jump in here and tell me what data we're collecting on child success?
Yes, so you covered a lot of them. For children under 17, we'll be able to collect anthropometric data. We'll have education, socioeconomic status for adult children, their fertility, which I realize isn't directly health, but then also qualitative assessments of their health by their parent, which isn't ideal, but especially for adult children who might not live in the home, that'll probably hopefully cover that.
Great, thank you.
As always with these comparative studies, or with any study for that matter, I think interpretation is key, and we're going to have to be careful about how we interpret these different measures of child outcomes.
Hi, everybody. So good to see you all. I'm wondering, again, kind of about the larger project. You know, how do you guys, I'm thinking about Bangladesh as one particular context. And just curious kind of what you expect to find, maybe. Especially, you know, in comparison to some of the other contexts. And the reason that I'm curious about this is because based on what I know anyway, the way that women in particular practice their religion in Bangladesh seems to be very private. While there's a lot of like signaling that goes on in terms of wearing, you know, burqas and things like that. Yeah, so anyway, maybe you know, I guess if Mary were here, she could talk more about that, but I'm just curious about how you kind of see the religion and kin thing interacting in a context like that, where you don't have the like social groups based around religion, or at least not the way that you see them in the West.
We're going to be collecting data firstly on religiosity, so how people are practicing their religion, and not just, well, including both private practice as well as public practice, to get an idea of religiosity. But we're also collecting data on social networks. So we're going to be asking people who helps you with X, Y, and Z, and who do you help with X, Y, and Z, including childcare. So what we should end up with are both measures of religiosity, but also people's social networks, which are not necessarily tied to their religiosity, although they may well be. In terms of what results we're going to find, that's a much bigger, more interesting question. But that's the data that we intend to collect anyway. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, yeah.
Can I maybe jump in? So the model, Mary is stuck in a meeting, so she apologized that she couldn't be here. She thought she was going to be able to, and she could probably answer this better. Also, Rich Sosis, who I believe is teaching, so he's not here, but he's written quite a bit about the sort of the puzzle of private religious practice. So underlying the model is one in which the model that we're testing is a signaling model of religion, where people are undertaking costs in order to communicate their trustworthiness to the group. So in such a model, private practice becomes a bit of a puzzle. He's argued that when you engage in private practice, you're effectively convincing yourself, or you're reinforcing the signal, so that when you are in public, you're much less likely to sort of screw up, and you give a more effective signal in public. So the more you engage in private practice, the sort of more reliably you communicate when you're in public. So I don't know if that's right, but that's sort of the interpretation that the model has, or one that's been given to it. But you're right, when there's no opportunities to communicate, then it's very unlikely that it would be building a strong social network.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious about how, and I mean, you know, you haven't collected the data yet, so of course that makes sense, but I'm really curious to see what you find in relationship to how religiosity interacts with, or maybe even effectively, you know, breaks up kin networks in a way, particularly when the practice is more in private. That'll be very interesting. Thanks, guys.
I think Simone has a question.
Hi, so this topic could not have been more apt for me this week, because my 2-month-old baby goes to daycare, started going to daycare this week. And me and my husband, we've been talking about the, you know, the professional help and like sort of allo parenting in the culture, in different cultures, etc. So I was wondering, so a lot of daycare here in Pennsylvania is based at the church. So while I was listening to your talk, I was thinking that maybe the secular people send their children to this like sort of business model of daycares, and probably the more religious people have these church daycares available to them, so they have sort of more sort of support in terms of sending their children for daycare. And is that something that you would examine in your data collection? Thank you.
In terms of daycare, I don't believe that kind of daycare exists yet in rural Malawi or rural Gambia, where we'll be working. Although, again, in that same issue of philosophical transactions of the Royal Society, a very interesting paper was published about daycare, paid private daycare in urban Nairobi. So it is coming to parts of urban Africa. So I think the issue of paid childcare is going to become very important in many different contexts in the future. But to answer your specific question, I don't believe it exists in the 2 study sites I'll be working with in particular. I'm not quite sure about the Indian or Bangladeshi context. In the US, I am sure we will be collecting data about daycare because it is an important part of allo parenting in Western populations. Again, perhaps somebody dealing with the US site, maybe Susie can jump in there. I will just finally comment though that it's quite interesting to hear that religious daycare is a big thing in the States. Coming from a secular country like the UK, it's not really a big thing here as far as I'm aware. Yeah, Susie, can you perhaps talk a little bit more about daycare on our US data collection site?
Sure. We do have so we're asking a lot of questions about focal children and who they receive care from, and they will be able to specify paid care there. Yes, so it's available to specify. I don't know that we have in-depth detailed questions about who the paid provider is in terms of if it's a religious organization or not, but this would be a good time to add that to our survey because we're just finalizing them. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I guess we should end the seminar here. Unless, John, you have anything else to say?
Only thank you. That was a great talk. And I'm glad so many people came. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. It's very nice to see so many familiar faces. So thank you very much. Bye.